Greetings, conservationists. Today we're going to talk about converting introduced grasslands to native prairie. And I realize now, after I'd made the title, I hope I didn't mislead you. We're not actually going to talk about the entirety of the process because it's a huge, big, expanded topic. And so we're going to kind of break it up. That was my intent, is to break up the content of creating prairie into a little more manageable bits. And in this talk, we're going to be talking about the conversion process of introduced grass to native grass. Maybe that probably wasn't a very good selling point to start off the talk, huh? When someone calls me up and they say, hey, I am interested in establishing some prairie on my farm or on land that I control, the first question that I ask is, what is growing there now? Because whatever the answer to that question is, it's going to steer the strategy that we use to build prairie. Because if the answer is, oh, well, there's nothing growing there because it's last year's soybean stubble or corn, then that's real easy. But in today's talk, we're going to focus on the answer being, well, it's cool season grass. This picture that's in the background, this is pretty typical of a project that I would run into. They say, I have an area of introduced grass. The farmer would probably not say that. They would probably say, oh, it's brome, which is what this picture is. Smooth brome. It's an introduced grass from Europe. Super incredibly common. It is basically everywhere. Anyway, they would say, yep, I have a field of brome and I'm interested in converting that into native grasses or, for hunting or grasses and wildflowers for birds and bees or whatever their end goal is. They want to put natives in there. It's in cool season grass and they want to go to natives. I was just saying, this is pretty typical. This field specifically is all smooth brome. It is 100% smooth brome. It's about an acre and a half size or something like that. You can see it's pretty, there's one type of grass through the whole thing. It is all just smooth brome. It doesn't necessarily have to be. There could be other cool season or introduced grass mixes that could be in there. It doesn't have to just be smooth brome. It could be, fescue or timothy, or could be some introduced legumes mixed in there or whatever. So we're just talking about introduced grasslands, and that could take up, there's a lot of different species that might make that up. And it also applies to lawns as well, or hay fields. So Kentucky bluegrass or lawn fescue is an introduced cool season grass. And all of the guidance that I'm going to put out here applies to that, probably just on a smaller scale. Where typically when I deal with people, they are enrolling in a government program like the Conservation Reserve Program to do a native seeding, and it is currently in brome cover, and they want to convert it over to native grass, either because they want to or because the program is, that's the practice that they enrolled in or whatever. Either way, this is a typical situation that we're going to find ourselves in, a brome field, and we want to make it natives. So we're going to talk about a little bit of why you would even want to do that in the first place. Then we're going to talk about the conversion process, the actual nuts and bolts of doing that. A little bit about using fire, how fire can be used to increase your effectiveness in converting brome or introduced grass to native grass. And then lastly, when to seed. And that is the part that, as I said before, hopefully you're not going to be disappointed about, because we're not going to be talking about a lot about seeding. That is a whole thing on its own. And I fully plan to do a full talk just about seeding in probably the late winter. Probably put one of these talks on the schedule for late winter when people are gearing up to do their seedings. Most people do seeding in the spring. And so I wanted to do a talk and reserve that for that time period, and then free this time period up to talk more about getting rid of the introduced grass. As you can see at the top, actually the key to converting to prairie is kill as much of the introduced grass as you can. That, if you take nothing else away from today's talk, remember that, because I've seen a lot of disasters happen because they did not do that thing. Kill as much of the grass as you can before you seed your prairie. Introduced grass is bad for prairies specifically. Now, not all introduced grass is necessarily bad. There's lots of uses for introduced grass, but in regards to prairies, introduced grass, not great. When we talk about introduced grass, a lot of time we're talking in the sense of prairies, we're talking about encroachment. And when by encroachment as a term, it is just a term for it when it's taking over the vegetative cover. There's undesirable vegetation that is taking over the desirable vegetation. So you can have brome encroachment or introduced grass encroachment. Cedars can encroach on prairie. That is what I'm talking about. So the introduced grass is taking over your desirable native grasses. And we can see it in this picture. This picture was taken in like March, I want to say, when I was doing a site visit, look at somebody's place, and all the dormant grass stands. You can see these clumps of all the little kind of brown tannish. That is all clumps of native grass for the most part. And then you can see in between all this green up, that is all, it's smooth brome and fescue in this picture. But anything that in March, if you're looking at stuff and it's green, there's probably a 95% chance, and it's a grass. If there's a green grass in March, 95% chance it is smooth brome, I would say. And you can really see how much a prairie is encroached upon by introduced grass in that early springtime. You can go out there and you can see this just covering of green in the understory. Sometimes it's a lot, and you can see where there's just a big patch or the entirety of the thing is green. That means that it's very heavily encroached by brome. And over time, those cool season grasses, specifically smooth brome, is especially bad. That's why I keep on bringing it up. I kind of fall into the trap of using them interchangeably, smooth brome and introduced grass. Smooth brome is an introduced grass that is very aggressive in prairies and is constantly a problem. It is not the only one that causes problems. It is just very, very common. So that's my own verbal trip up, just because I've been traumatized by brome working with prairies for years. Going back to it though, over time, introduced grass, especially smooth brome, will just slowly outcompete prairies in the absence, especially in the absence of fire or other types of management that can suppress brome or introduced grasses. The introduced grass will just kind of slowly take over and suppress the native grasses. And that just leads to lower diversity, poor stand health, all kinds of things. And if you want a good stand of native grasses and wildflowers, then one of the things you have to do is manage for introduced grasses, manage against them. That leads back to that question that I asked, the first question, what's growing there now? If the answer is it's a brome field, then you have to kill as much of it as possible. Otherwise, you're just going to get a field of brome. Because if you don't get all of it, if you don't kill all of the existing cool season grass, especially if it's brome or other stuff, like reed canary grass is also particularly bad, but that's a whole other topic on itself. But if you don't kill the introduced grass, as much of it as possible, it's just going to come back, and it'll come back faster, and it will encroach upon your prairie all that much faster. So the key is to get rid of it as much as possible. With that takeaway message, kill as much of it as possible. And that's why, because it'll take over your prairie. We're going to get into the nuts and bolts of the conversion process. Perhaps I am a little biased towards these guide sheets because I helped to develop them, but I'm really proud of them. They are great. This one specifically is about planting prairie into cool season sod, doing that conversion from introduced grass to natives. And it is a great summary, no extraneous information. It is a one-page sheet that a farmer can look at step by step and understand what they need to do. And that is what we wanted to develop. And this does that very well. And this is the information that we're going to talk about today. We'll go back to our typical project. This is the frame that we're going to talk about. So it's this little field and it is brome. So in your imagination, you can envision this field, or you can envision your own project as well. All the steps are going to be the same. I just wanted to give you a frame of reference of what we're talking about. So the process. The first thing you are going to want to do is mow or hay that field sometime in August. Usually the earlier the better, But in August sometime, cool season grasses, usually they go into a period of semi-dormancy during the hot months. And in August, they're going to be coming out of that. So when you go and you mow or you hay, then you're going to remove all the standing kind of dead, dry stuff from previous years, all the thatch, if you will. And then you're also going to stimulate regrowth of that existing cool season grass, because as it cools down then going into the fall, those cool season grasses are going to go into a second growth period, and they're going to kind of put out a flush of new grass. And you see that in your lawn typically, you know, when it's hot, it kind of dries up and stops growing. But then when it cools off, usually it starts going, and you got to mow a few more times before it finally freezes and you can put your mower away, right? And all these introduced grasses do the exact same thing. So they'll go through a second growth period in September, and then it'll be this nice flush green growth that you can then spray with herbicide. And some people might poo-poo that, spraying with herbicide, but honestly, it's the only way that's really going to work. The fall spraying is the absolute most vital thing that you can do that you need to do to convert from cool season grasses to natives. So just to kind of rehash, you're going to mow it in August, and that's going to create green growth that you can then spray in September or early October. And that is ahead of the first hard frost, which usually comes in mid-October, somewhere in there. And around that time, that frost is what's going to cause all that introduced grass to go dormant. And it's a thing where we're using the biology of the plant against it, because we are spraying it with herbicide when it's actively growing, and then it's going to go dormant, and it's going to translocate that chemical down into the root system, and then it's going to get a good efficient kill. So you want to use probably something like a glyphosate product. We'll talk more about herbicides after a bit. It doesn't matter to me what chemical you use, as long as it is labeled for the effect that you're going for. Most people, the vast majority of people, will use a glyphosate product, which is the active ingredient in Roundup. So there is a bunch of different glyphosate products. You can buy it on the shelf at basically any farm supply store that you walk into. Most people use glyphosate product at whatever the labeled rate is for that specific product. You can use other things as well. There's a bunch of that people can use grass selective herbicides, or there's a bunch of other stuff that does the exact same thing as glyphosate. Glyphosate is just the really common one. And then you can also use a broadleaf killer if there's a need for it. The guide sheet will mention that. It talks about using 2,4-D, which is a broadleaf killer if you have like alfalfa or other introduced legumes that tend to hang on a little bit and are kind of resistant to glyphosate. So you can use, I just kept it general. Use whatever herbicide is going to accomplish the mission. That is the main thing. Most people use glyphosate. Some other people will use other things as well, or glyphosate plus extra chemicals. But the main thing is you want to spray it in that period right before it goes dormant, and that is where you get your main source of mortality from. Mow it in August, spray it in the fall before it goes dormant, and then you're going to wait through the wintertime, and then in the spring when it greens up, I wrote May-ish because it can vary depending on the year, but you're going to want to spray it again in the spring. So mow in August, spray in the fall, and then spray again in the spring. And you want to do that after it's been growing for a little bit. You don't want to just be peeking out of the ground and go spray it. You want to be out and actively have active growing vegetation above the ground to be receptive to the herbicide. And you also want it to be warm enough so the herbicide is going to work, because different chemicals will have to have different air temperatures to be able to activate. And so you'll want to have it be 5 to 8 inches probably of regrowth in the spring. And then I always tell people to then wait about a week and then evaluate to see if it needs either a third spraying in the spring, or if you need to do an alternate plan, and we'll get down to that in the bottom. So that's the fourth step. So mow, spray it again, and then evaluate it to see if it needs anything extra. And then if it doesn't need anything extra, go ahead and seed that baby. Seed it down in May through June. You got a whole big window to get your seeding done. And again, I'm not going to get real deep into the seeding aspect of things during this talk. We'll talk about that later. There's a lot that can go into the seeding itself. We're just talking about dates for the most part right now. Or based on your evaluation, you might decide, or maybe it's part of your plan all along, that you want to let that thing, you want to have the field go just sit fallow over the summer. So you can let it be fallow and sit with standing dead grass. And then some of that is going to continue to green up in patches probably. And you can go out and spray that over the summer. And then probably depending on the grass and how aggressive it is and holding on, you can go and spray it again in the fall and then seed it in November. November 15th is the accepted date to do dormant seeding. So anytime after November 15th is typically when you want to do a fall seeding. So two options really. You can do the mow in August, spray fall, spray again in the spring, seed it if everything's good. If you want to make sure that everything is dead, or if you have reason to believe that everything's not dead for whatever reason, then you want to wait and then spray it over the summer, spray it again in the fall to make sure you get your double fall kill, and then do your seeding. And some people will ask, well, could I do like 2 sprayings in the spring and then seed it? No, I do not recommend that whatsoever. A lot of people ask that. I'm not sure where that comes from. Maybe it's just reliance or trust in herbicide effectiveness, but you have to absolutely have a fall spraying if you have any expectation of killing introduced grasses like smooth brome. I always recommend a minimum of 2 sprayings, one of which has to be a fall spraying. Let's say things get messed up. You can't exactly follow this timeline, and maybe you want to try to do a spring spraying and then wait over the summer, do a fall spraying, and then seed in the fall. Well, that could work. I don't recommend that. The problem is that you are missing, in that case, you are missing out on this part, that evaluation. So you're basically, by spraying in the spring, waiting, spraying in the fall, and then seeding, you're committing to that seeding because there's no spraying after that. In that case, you're giving up your ability to evaluate the seeding to see if you need to do any additional spraying. Because again, the mission is to kill as much of the introduced grass as you possibly can. And if you don't know that you have, if you don't know what your effectiveness was, because you haven't gone around the calendar back to the following spring after your fall spraying, then you don't know how much grass how much of a good kill you got. I recommend this conversion process that I have right in front of you. This is also the one that's in the guide sheet. If things don't work out for you timeline wise, you might be able to get away with an alternative where you do a spring spraying followed by a fall spraying. But again, that follows that rule of 2 sprayings, one of which has to be a fall spraying. That is your kind of backup plan. But this would be the primary, I would say. This would be the way to go. Incidentally, a little bit on programs. If you are working with a program like Conservation Reserve Program, there might be special rules that come into play, especially in terms of haying. So haying in August or haying period, you might need to inquire with depending on what program you're using, you just need to inquire with whoever is the administrator of that program. So in the case of Conservation Reserve Program, it's the Farm Service Agency. You need to check in with them to see if that's something that you can do or should do. There just might be special guidance. Again, I try to make these talks program neutral because there's a lot of people that may be using it for different programs or programs in another state even. And so the rules may vary depending on the program or the situation you're in. So I'm trying to keep it kind of neutral. Just do your due diligence, make sure that you're following the guidelines that are outlined by the program you're enrolled in, if there is one. If you're just doing this out of your own pocket, especially if you're doing it like your lawn or something like that, yeah, just follow these steps. That is exactly what I would do. because we covered a lot of ground right there on that one slide. There was lots of words and lots of talking and not very many pictures, and I apologize for that. But that's it for the process for the most part. And then I want to talk about how we can use fire real quickly, how we can use fire to increase our effectiveness. I wanted to include this picture. This is my wife, Michelle. She is very enthusiastic about burning my mom's prairie in this photo. This is me. I'm all the way over here eating smoke. Anyway, in my mom's place, we converted her hayfield. She has a 2.5 acre hayfield that was mixed brome, fescue, timothy, and lots of foxtail and a bunch of introduced legumes. And so we basically went through this process, converting it to monarch habitat. And it's an ongoing process, but I am comfortable with fire. I work with fire quite a bit. My wife does as well. And we have a bunch of biologist friends that do fire. So we used fire to help this conversion process along. Well, this is the conversion process that we just went over. It's all the same stuff, so you don't have to go into it. And spoiler alert, if you're going to use fire, you're going to stick it in that blank spot right there. So the process with fire is the same exact thing, only you're going to stick it in right in that early spring period ahead of that spring, ahead of the spring. Okay. So early spring fire, you don't necessarily have to do fire. I marked on there that it is optional, just as a reminder. You don't necessarily have to use fire, but a lot of people always ask about it, and it does have good effects. Basically, you want to go out when it says early spring, whenever it is dry enough to catch fire, go and do it. That is the timing, basically. So if you can go as early as you can go out and burn it, that would be when you want to do it. Going back to the process, so you mowed it, you removed all the thatch, and then you let it green up, and then you sprayed it again. So now you have a bunch of standing dead there. And then you can actually see that right here. So this is all the thatch of some foxtail that had grown up in that early springtime. As soon as it was available for fire, then we went out, burned it, and that is going to create a nice flush of growth that can then be receptive to spraying. And so you're going to be setting yourself up for good success that way, because if you don't do that, then there's going to be a certain amount of efficiency that you're going to lose with the herbicide, because the standing dead that's there from the fall spraying is going to block the herbicide, and the plants that you're trying to treat, the introduced grass that is there, or annual weeds, or whatever the stuff that you're trying to treat that's in there, you're trying to treat with the herbicide, it's going to need time to grow up through that thatch and then be available. In that way, you can by burning it, you can remove all the thatch, cause some nice regrowth that is then available to get sprayed with herbicide and get killed. That's the main thing. And then when to seed, that is often a question that people ask and kind of get hung up on, quite honestly. The question that people ask is, when is the best time to seed? And the answer is, it depends. It depends on so many different factors. And honestly, I don't think that is even the most important question. When is the best time to seed? Because the answer ultimately is whenever the existing grass is dead. Like, that is the answer. That's the best time to seed. And so what you need to do is plan your project for however many sprayings it's going to take to kill the existing cover. So if you're following on that timeline that I gave in the process, then you're going to start in the late summer of the year before you do the seeding, or potentially a full year before you do the seeding. The most important thing is that you make sure that you do the seeding after all the existing grass is dead. That is absolutely the most important thing. Most of the time that is going to be in the spring, because people start usually in the late summer doing their mowing, and then they do their fall spraying. Then they do the rest of their work, the spraying, the spring spraying and the evaluation, maybe a third spraying, and then seed it. And that all happens in the spring. So spring is definitely the most common time to do native seedings. Is it the best? Well, not necessarily. Like I said, there's a lot of factors that go into when the best time to seed is. Generally speaking, if your mix has a lot of grass in it, or it is mostly grass, warm season native grasses we're talking about, those do better when they're planted in the spring. If on the other hand, you have a highly diverse wildflower planting, like if you're doing pollinator habitat, or you just have a lot of wildflower seeds in it and not very much grass, then in general, you want to do the fall. But even within that, there's a lot of factors that can go into uh, the success of the stand establishment. Like some species many forb species have to go wildflowers. Many wildflowers have to go through a freeze thaw cycle before they will germinate. Not all of them, many of them do though. And that's why fall is the better time for them, because you're sticking them in the ground right before it goes into the winter. So they goes through that freeze thaw feet. They go through that freeze thaw stratification and then go when they germinate in the spring. Grasses don't, some of them do, but most of them do not have to do that. And they just germinate when it gets hot enough. And so spring ahead of the summer is good for that. But it is not necessarily always the case. And there's a lot of weather factors that go into it, because if it's really dry, it might set back your establishment. There's just so many factors that can change the behavior of the seeding and cause it to be slow to establish, that honestly, I think that it's better just to focus, in this case especially, you want to focus on when the grass is going to be dead and use that to guide when you should seed, and not necessarily when it's best for the seeds to germinate themselves. To summarize, I said it in the first one, but the whole point of this whole thing is to make sure that you kill as much of the introduced grass as you can. If you're converting a prairie, that is the absolute thing that you need to accomplish. Kill as much of the introduced grass, especially the brome, as you can, because introduced grass is bad for prairies. It can encroach on it and crowd out your seeding. And if you want a native seeding, then brome is your enemy. And you want to make sure that you can kill as much of it up front as you can, so that it sets you up well to have a nice stand for as long as you can. The conversion process for converting from introduced grass to prairie, then, as I've said before, you want to mow it in August. You want to do a fall spraying, because you spray it ahead of the dormancy period, and that's where you get your good mortality. Then you want to spray it again in the spring, and then you want to evaluate it to see what else it needs. It might need a third spraying, or it might need to go fallow over the summer to do some extra spraying in the summer and the fall, and then seed it in November. Or it might, after your evaluation, you might be like, yep, everything is dead as a doornail, and you can just go out and seed it and move right into your establishment. Then thirdly, I guess, you can use fire to invigorate your introduced grass and then kill it. And you can do that by doing a early spring burn after your fall spraying through that winter. As soon as it gets melted and dried off enough to carry fire, you can go out and burn it. That's going to turn the ground black, cause your seed bank to germinate, and any existing plants that didn't die from the fall spraying to flush. Then you can go out and spray them. Makes it very receptive, and makes the plants very receptive for herbicide, makes your herbicide very effective because there's nothing to block it. Works great. And then follow it up with your spring spraying. Then lastly, you want to plan your seeding ultimately for when the grass kill is going to be fully complete and successful. Because again, introduced grass is the enemy. So you want to make sure you kill as much of it as possible, and you should plan your project accordingly as far as the timeline goes. But follow that guide sheet. It has great information in it, and it summarizes all this stuff that I've talked about quite beautifully and succinctly.